The silence that followed her husband's passing was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a shared glance across a hearth, but the hollow, ringing quiet of absence. Agnes felt it most keenly in town, in the Havenwood General Store, where the air was thick with the smells of salt pork and dried apples and the unspoken pity of her neighbors. At 35, she was a widow, a stray piece in a community where every piece had its designated place. Mayor Thornton, a man whose belly strained the buttons of his waistcoat, cleared his throat, a sound like gravel being shoveled. "Agnes, you must be practical," he began, his tone dripping with a condescension he mistook for fatherly concern. "A woman alone, on that mountain property, it isn't seemly. It isn't safe. The winters here are not kind." He gestured vaguely at the shelves of flour and beans. "Sell the land. Tom left you the deed, free and clear. You can buy a small room in town. Mrs. Gable always needs help with her laundry." Agnes stared at a crack in the floorboards, tracing its path with her eyes. "Laundry. Mending. Taking in boarders. A life of small, dependent tasks, shrinking day by day under the weight of community approval. She had spent 10 years on that mountain with Tom, learning its moods, its waters, its stony heart. It was the only place that felt like hers. She lifted her gaze, meeting Thornton's. Her eyes were a pale, steady gray, like river stones under water. "I have 2 milk cows and 4 goats, Mayor." "They are not suited for a room in town." Thornton waved a dismissive hand. "The animals can be sold. A good price, I'd see to it myself. It's for your own good. A blizzard comes, who will chop your wood? Who will clear a path?" His voice was the voice of reason, of practicality, the voice of a world she no longer fit into. "I will," she said. The words were quiet, but they landed in the store's dusty air with the finality of a hammer striking an anvil. A few onlookers shifted their weight. This was not the expected response. A widow was supposed to be grateful, pliant, accepting of charity. She was not supposed to have a will of her own. "That's foolish pride, Agnes," Thornton snapped, his patience fraying. "The mountain will break you." Agnes picked up her small sack of salt and flour. "The mountain and I have an understanding," she replied, her voice even. She paid the clerk, her movements deliberate, feeling the weight of every gaze. As she walked out, the mayor's final words followed her like a curse. "Don't come begging to us when the snows lock you in." She did not turn back. The walk home was long, the autumn air crisp with the promise of cold. She wasn't just walking away from the town, she was walking toward an idea, a wild and desperate seed of a plan that had taken root in the stony soil of her grief. They saw a helpless widow. They would learn. Back at the small, sturdy cabin Tom had built, the world fell away into the familiar rhythms of work. The 2 cows, Patience and Clover, lowed softly as she approached, their warm breath misting in the cooling air. The goats bleated from their pen, nimble and noisy. This was her world now. Not a world of pity and laundry, but of living things, of responsibility, of tangible, life-giving work. The cabin was solid, but the root cellar was a shallow, dirt-walled pit, prone to damp and inconsistent temperatures. It was fine for a few months of potatoes and carrots, but it was no place to build a future. Preserving the milk from her small herd was the key. Milk was life, but it was fleeting. In summer it spoiled in a day. In winter it froze solid. But transformed, solidified, aged, it could become sustenance. It could become wealth. It could become independence. Cheese. The thought was a beacon. Tom had been a man who noticed things. He hadn't been a talker, but he was an observer. He'd once pointed to the north face of the ridge that rose behind their cabin. "That there," he'd said, tapping his pipe on a rock, "is limestone shale. Cuts like soap, some of it. Stays cold as a well-digger's resolve deep into July." The memory, once a simple observation, now echoed with profound significance. A cave. Not a natural one, but one she would carve herself. A place deep in the mountain's belly where the temperature was constant, the natural cellar insulated by 1,000 tons of rock. A place where milk could become cheese and cheese could become time, stacked and waiting. It was a ludicrous idea. The kind of plan a madman might conceive. A lone woman with a pickaxe and a shovel, intending to hollow out a mountain? She looked at her hands. They were not delicate. They were calloused and strong from a decade of farm work. She looked at the mountain. It was immense, impassive, ancient. It did not care about her grief or her defiance. It simply was. The challenge was terrifying. But the alternative, the slow, spiritual death in a rented room in Havenwood, reeking of other people's lye soap and pity, was infinitely more so. That evening, as the sun bled out behind the jagged peaks, she found Tom's tools. The pick was heavy, its hickory handle worn smooth by his grip. The shovel was broad and sharp. She hefted the pick, feeling its solid, unforgiving weight. It was a tool of deconstruction, of breaking things apart. She would use it to build. The mountain waited, its shadow falling over her small cabin. She would not be broken by it. She would become a part of it. The first strike of the pick against the rock face was a shock that jolted up her arms and into her shoulders. It was a pathetic chip, a mere scratch on the weathered grey stone. The mountain barely registered the insult. Agnes spat on her hands, adjusted her grip, and swung again. And again. This was the beginning of a conversation that would last for months, a dialogue spoken in sweat and muscle and the grating song of steel on stone. Her days fell into a brutal, monastic routine. Wake before dawn. Milk the cows and goats. A quick meal of oatmeal and whey. Then, the mountain. The work was a lesson in humility and physics. She learned that brute force was a fool's errand. The mountain could absorb any amount of mindless violence and give back nothing but exhaustion. She had to learn to read the stone, to find the hairline fractures, the subtle shifts in color and texture that signaled a weakness. She learned to use the pick not as a hammer, but as a wedge, to pry and persuade the rock along its natural seams. The shale Tom had spoken of was layered like pages in a book, and her job was to find the edge of the page and peel it back. Each wheelbarrow of rock and dirt she hauled away felt like a monumental victory. She created a growing fan of scree at the base of the cliff, a testament to her progress. Blisters formed on her palms, broke, and hardened into thick calluses. Her back screamed in protest each evening. There were days of despair when she would hit a seam of quartzite or granite, a stubborn knot in the mountain's grain that resisted her for hours, yielding only dust and sparks. On those days, the voices from town echoed in her head. Foolish pride. It will break you. She would sit on the pile of rubble, her body trembling with effort, and look down at her small cabin, the thin curl of smoke from its chimney. She would see Clover and Patience grazing peacefully. This was real. The town was a ghost. She was not just digging a hole, she was digging her way out of the grave they had prepared for her. One afternoon, a sudden slide of loose shale from above the entrance sent a cascade of sharp-edged rocks tumbling down, one of them slicing a deep gash in her forearm. She stanched the bleeding with a strip torn from her apron, her heart hammering not with fear but with a cold fury. The mountain was teaching her another lesson: pay attention. It demanded respect. From then on, she spent the first hour of each day shoring up the entrance, reinforcing the walls and ceiling of her tunnel with carefully chosen, interlocking stones. She was no longer just a digger, she was becoming an engineer, a stonemason, a geologist. She was learning the architecture of survival. Weeks bled into a month, then 2. The tunnel grew, inch by painstaking inch. It was a raw, dark passage, barely tall enough for her to stand upright, and it smelled of damp earth, crushed stone, and the metallic tang of her own sweat. The air grew cooler the deeper she went, a promising sign. Then, one day, the texture of the rock changed under her pick. The hard, grating resistance gave way to a softer, more yielding feel. She swung again, and the pick head punched through into emptiness with a hollow thud. She froze, listening. There was no sound but her own ragged breathing and the drip of water somewhere in the darkness. Cautiously, she worked at the opening, widening it until it was large enough to squeeze through. She lit her lantern and pushed it into the void. The light flickered, revealing not a vast cavern, but a small, natural fissure, a crack in the mountain's heart no more than 10 feet wide and 20 feet long. The walls were smooth, almost polished, and slick with moisture. The air was shockingly cold, still, and pure. It was a natural cold locker, a space that had likely held this same deep chill for 1,000 years. This was it. This was the place. It was more than she could have hoped for. The mountain had not just yielded to her efforts, it had offered a gift. Over the next week, she transformed the space. She widened the passage from her tunnel, making it a proper doorway. She used the flat, strong pieces of slate she excavated to build a floor, carefully sloping it towards a narrow channel she dug along one wall, a place for moisture and way to drain away. The real challenge was ventilation. A sealed cave would grow stale and moldy. Cheese needed to breathe. She remembered watching smoke rise from the cabin chimney, how it sought the path of least resistance. She needed to create a similar path for the air. She spent days searching the slopes above her cave entrance until she found what she was looking for, a narrow, vertical crevice in the rock that seemed to rise a great distance. Back in the cave, using a hand drill and a small chisel, she began the arduous task of boring a narrow shaft upwards from the ceiling of the fissure, aiming for that crevice. It was slow, agonizing work, her arms aching as she hammered the chisel above her head, dust and rock flecks raining down on her face. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the chisel broke through. A trickle of cool, fresh air flowed down, a sign of success. She had created a natural chimney, a passive engine that would draw the warmer, heavier air out of the cave and pull in fresh, cool air from her entrance tunnel. It was a simple, elegant system, powered by the mountain itself. She stood in the center of her creation, lantern held high. The cold, the dark, the silence. It was not an empty space. It was a sanctuary, a workshop, a fortress. It was the heart of her new life. A year passed. The work was endless but fulfilling. One day in late summer, a stooped figure leading a mule appeared on the path to her cabin. It was Finn, a traveling tinker and trader who made a circuit through the isolated homesteads every year. He was a man with a face like a dried apple, all wrinkles and shrewd humor, and he'd known Tom. He expected to find Agnes gone or struggling, a charity case. He tipped his hat. "Afternoon. Here for blades that need sharpening, pots that need mending." Agnes wiped her dusty hands on her apron. "I've got a kettle with a loose handle. And I could use a good wire for cutting curd." Finn's eyebrows rose slightly at the mention of curd. He followed her to the cabin, and while he worked his tools with practiced ease, she brought him a cup of fresh, cool buttermilk. It was a hot day, and he drank it gratefully. "Heard in Havenwood they expected you to pack it in," he said, not unkindly, hammering a rivet. "Mayor Thornton seems to think this mountain's got it in for you." Agnes just smiled, a small, private thing. "The mayor and I have different ideas about what's good for me." Finn was a practical man who respected competence above all else. He could see it in the neat stack of firewood, the healthy sheen on her animals' coats, the determined set of her jaw. He was curious. "Curd, you said. Making a bit of cheese for the winter." "A bit," she said. "I've built a place for it." An hour later, after trading a mended pot for a wedge of fresh, soft goat cheese that was sharp and creamy on the tongue, he couldn't contain his curiosity any longer. She led him to the north face of the ridge. He saw the tons of excavated rock and whistled low. He followed her into the tunnel, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. When she opened the inner stone door and the deep, profound cold of the cave washed over them, he fell silent. He looked at the sloped stone floor, the neat drainage channel, the ventilation shaft high above. He ran a hand over the smooth, cool stone shelves she had built into the walls, already filling with small, pale wheels of aging cheese. He wasn't a man given to grand pronouncements, but he stood in the middle of her cave, turning in a slow circle, and simply said, "Well, I'll be." He understood immediately what she had done. He hadn't seen anything like it. He asked a few sharp questions. "How do you keep the runoff from souring the floor?" She showed him the drainage channel, how it led to a gravel pit well away from the entrance. "The air stays sweet. No mold." She pointed to the vent. It breathes, he nodded, a deep and appreciative gesture. He saw not madness, but genius. A practical, hard-won genius. He stayed for 2 days, and in that time, he gave her more than just mended pots. He didn't offer advice, but he shared knowledge, trader to producer. He told her about the different salts that drew out more moisture, making for a harder, longer-lasting cheese. He explained how wrapping the wheels in clean muslin, soaked in melted lard, would prevent the rind from cracking in the dry winter air. He was her first and only mentor, a man who saw her work not as a woman's folly, but as a masterclass in survival. As he packed his mule to leave, he made her a proposition. "You give me 2 of those goat wheels now," he said, "and next year, I'll bring you a roll of fine tin for lining your press and pails. And," he added, "I'll take 5 of your best aged cow's milk wheels to trade down in Amber Creek and Stone Fall. Let them taste what a mountain can make." Agnes agreed. It was more than a trade. It was a connection to the world, on her own terms. The dairy became the center of her universe. The cave was no longer just a cold space, it was a living one, a library of carefully catalogued work. Each wheel of cheese was dated, its origin, cow or goat, noted with a small charcoal mark on the stone shelf beneath it. Her life was a cycle, governed not by the town clock or the church bell, but by the rhythms of her animals and the slow, magical transformation happening in the dark. The milking at dawn and dusk, the straining of the warm, rich liquid. The heating of the milk in a great copper pot over her hearth, the careful addition of rennet. The patient waiting for the curd to set. The cutting of the curd with the fine wire Finn had brought her, the gentle stirring, the separation of the cloudy whey from the solid mass. Then came the pressing. She had built a press from a heavy oak lever and a basket of stones, a simple, powerful machine that squeezed the last of the whey from the cheese, compacting it into a dense, solid wheel. Finally, the salting, a crucial step that would protect it and give it flavor, her hands working the coarse salt into every surface. Each wheel was then carried into the mountain's cool embrace, placed on its shelf to begin the long, slow process of aging. She made different kinds, learning as she went. A hard, sharp goat cheese that grew more intense with time. A milder, creamier cow's milk cheese, vaguely nutty and endlessly versatile. It was a science and an art, and she was its sole practitioner. Her days were full of labor, but it was a labor that built something. She wasn't just surviving, she was creating. She was taking the transient, perishable gift of milk and turning it into something permanent, something that could defy a season. The pile of stones outside her cave grew, but inside, her true wealth accumulated. Row upon row of golden wheels, a bulwark against hunger, against dependence, against the pity of men like Mayor Thornton. She had carved out not just a space in the rock, but a space for herself in the world, a sovereignty built on work, knowledge, and the quiet, steady beat of her own heart. She was no longer just Agnes, the widow. She was Agnes, the cheesemaker. And her larder was growing full. The first winter after building the cave was the proving ground. While Havenwood huddled under a blanket of ordinary snow, Agnes was secure. The passage to her cave was sheltered from the worst of the drifts, and inside, the temperature held at a steady 40 degrees, perfect for aging. The ventilation shaft worked flawlessly, keeping the air fresh and preventing the cloying damp that could ruin her work. She had her stored vegetables, a small supply of smoked meat, and, most importantly, her cheese. It was more than food, it was a victory she could taste. She would sit by her fire in the evenings, a slice of her hard, aged cheese and a piece of dense bread her only company, and feel a profound sense of peace. She had done it. She had faced the mountain, and it had not broken her. It had sheltered her. When spring thawed the land, Finn returned as promised. His eyes widened when he saw the sheer quantity of cheese now lining the shelves. He ran a reverent hand over a large wheel of cow's milk cheese, its rind a perfect, pale gold. "Agnes," he said, his voice hushed with respect. "You've not just made a living. You've made a fortress." He upheld his end of the bargain, providing her with sheets of tin and new tools, but the real transaction was in the cheese he loaded onto his mule. He took 10 wheels that year, leaving her with more than enough. He was her ambassador, her connection to the wider world. He carried her reputation, wheel by golden wheel, down from the mountain. The stories he told in Amber Creek and Stonefall, the two villages in the neighboring valleys, were of a kind of mountain witch, but a benevolent one, a woman who could conjure food from stone and cold. The cheese spoke for itself. It was dense, rich, and had a flavor that spoke of high pastures and deep, cool earth. It was nothing like the bland, inconsistent farmhouse cheeses they were used to. It was the taste of mastery. Her name, once whispered with pity in Havenwood, was now spoken with a new kind of curiosity in the valleys beyond. She was becoming a local legend, a mystery to be solved. The summer and autumn of 1884 were a period of intense production. Word of her cheese, carried by Finn and the occasional bold trapper, had spread. Now, it wasn't just Finn who made the journey to her door. A farmer from Amber Creek came, wanting to trade a side of bacon and 2 sacks of potatoes for a wheel. A woman from Stonefall brought hand-knitted wool stockings and a jar of precious honey. Agnes became a nexus of trade, her mountain dairy a new kind of general store. She dealt fairly, trading pound for pound, value for value. She asked nothing of their lives and offered nothing of hers, beyond the cheese. The transactions were clean, respectful. These people didn't see a pitiable widow, they saw a producer, a craftswoman. They saw the results of her labor, and they respected it. In Havenwood, Mayor Thornton heard the rumors. Nonsense, he declared at the store. She's probably starving up there, eating bark. This is just some story a tinker made up, but a few of his own townsfolk, men with more sense than pride, made the journey secretly and came back with cheese that silenced the doubters. Thornton grew resentful, his prediction of her failure turning to ash in his mouth. Her success was a quiet rebuke to his authority, to his entire worldview. Agnes paid him no mind. She was too busy. She had expanded her herd, trading a young goat for a new milk cow. The cave was a marvel of organization, its shelves groaning under the weight of hundreds of pounds of aging cheese. It was a bank, a larder, a legacy in the making. As autumn deepened, a strange feeling settled over the mountains. The squirrels were frantic, burying nuts with a desperate intensity. The deer came down from the high country weeks earlier than usual. The nights grew cold with a sudden, biting ferocity that felt different from previous years. The first snow came in October, a light dusting that melted by noon but left a chill in the air that did not leave. An old Ute trapper, passing by on his way to winter grounds, stopped for a moment at her cabin. He accepted a cup of water but refused to stay. He looked at the sky, at the strange, milky quality of the light. "Big snow comes," he said, his English clipped. "Soon." "Stay close to the mountain," he nodded at her cave entrance. "You are wise." Agnes felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. She redoubled her efforts, chopping more wood than she thought she could possibly need, ensuring her animal's shelter was secure, and making one last, large batch of cheese before the milk production slowed for the winter. The mountain was humming with a low, ancient warning, and she was listening. The blizzard did not arrive. It descended. One afternoon the sky turned a bruised, slate gray, and the wind fell into an unnerving silence. Then, the first flakes began to fall, not the gentle, wandering flakes of a normal snow, but small, hard pellets, driven by a wind that rose from a whisper to a shriek in the space of an hour. By nightfall, the world outside her cabin had vanished into a churning vortex of white. The great blizzard of 1884 had begun. For 3 days, it did not stop. The wind howled like a hungry beast, piling snow into monstrous drifts that buried fences and reshaped the landscape. Agnes was safe. Her cabin was stout, banked with earth and snow, her woodshed full. The passage to her cheese cave remained partly open, protected by the overhang of the cliff face. She could move between her small zone of warmth and her vast larder of cold. She tended her animals in the small, sturdy barn, their body heat creating a pocket of relative warmth. She was an island of stability in a sea of chaos. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that the villages were in desperate trouble. They lived more exposed lives, dependent on daily trips for wood, on barns that might not withstand the weight of the snow, on supply lines that were now utterly severed. They would have their root cellars, their salted meats, but how long could that last? After a week, the snow stopped, but the cold deepened, a brutal, relentless cold that froze the very marrow in the bones. The sky was a painfully bright, indifferent blue. The world was silent, beautiful, and deadly. One afternoon, she saw movement at the edge of the woods. A figure, stumbling, falling, rising again. It was a young man, clad in layers of ragged wool, his face a mask of wind-burned skin and ice-caked beard. He was on crude snowshoes, and he collapsed 20 yards from her door. Agnes hauled him inside, dragging him like a sack of grain. She stripped off his frozen outer layers and wrapped him in blankets by the fire, forcing warm broth between his cracked lips. His name was Daniel, and he was from Amber Creek. He told her a story of buried homes, of frozen cattle, of the community's single store of flour running out. He spoke of hunger, a real and terrifying hunger that was settling over the 3 villages. They were completely isolated. "We heard the stories," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Finn stories. About the mountain woman. We didn't know if they were true." He had made the journey as a last, desperate gamble. "Is it true?" he asked, his eyes pleading. "Do you have food?" Agnes looked at the young man, his body trembling with cold and exhaustion. She thought of her cave. Her fortress. The hundreds of wheels of cheese, enough to keep her fed and secure for years. A private treasure, born of her own sweat and defiance. She could keep it for herself. No one would ever know. It was her right. She had earned it. Agnes stood and walked to the door, opening it a crack. The cold that flooded in was sharp as a blade. She looked out at the pristine, unforgiving landscape. She thought of Mayor Thornton's words, "Don't come begging to us." The temptation to embrace that bitterness, to hoard her safety and let the world that scorned her fend for itself, was a dark and seductive warmth. It would be a kind of justice, a righteous and solitary victory. But what kind of victory was it, to sit alone in a fortress, fat and safe, while others starved? The faces of the people who had traded with her, the farmer from Amber Creek, the woman from Stonefall, floated in her mind. They had treated her with respect. They were in trouble. Even the people of Havenwood, who had followed Thornton's lead, had children, had elders. Her quarrel was with one man's pride, not with a whole community's survival. She closed the door and turned back to Daniel, who was watching her with fearful eyes. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and firm in the small cabin. "It's true. Finish your broth. Then I will show you." She led him through the snow to the cave. When she pulled open the heavy stone door and held the lantern aloft, the young man gasped. He was staring at a miracle. Rows and rows of cheese, a king's ransom of food, glowing in the lantern light. It was a sight beyond his wildest hopes. "Help me," she said, and her voice held the quiet authority of a general. She was no longer just a cheesemaker. She was a quartermaster in a war against winter. She showed Daniel how to lash saplings together to make a small, efficient sled. She taught him not to fight the deep snow, but to use the windswept ridges where the ground was scoured almost bare. She loaded the sled with as much cheese as he could pull, wrapping the wheels tightly. "Go to Amber Creek first," she instructed. "Tell them to send 2 more men. Then send one of those men to Stonefall, and the other to Havenwood. Tell them Agnes sent you. Tell them there is food in the mountain." He left, a small figure pulling a precious cargo across a vast, white world. A few days later, they began to arrive. Small, desperate parties of men, their faces grim with hardship, their hope fragile. They came first from Amber Creek and Stonefall, then, finally, a group from Havenwood. Mayor Thornton was with them. He looked older, smaller, his bluster stripped away by the cold and the fear. He would not meet her eyes. He stood, hat in hand, while his men loaded their sled. Agnes supervised the distribution, a quiet, commanding presence. She was not merciful, she was practical. She rationed the cheese carefully, ensuring each village got a fair share, enough to see them through the worst of it. She gave them instructions on how to travel, how to conserve their strength. She asked for nothing in return. As the Havenwood party was about to leave, Thornton finally looked at her. His face was a mixture of shame and disbelief. "Agnes," he stammered. I was wrong." Agnes simply nodded. She did not need his apology. His presence here, a beggar at the door of the woman he had tried to expel, was apology enough. "See that it gets to the families first," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. She watched them go, sleds laden with her cheese, her work, her defiance. She turned and went back into her cave. The shelves were noticeably emptier. But for the first time, the cold, silent space felt truly full. The great blizzard of 1884 broke in late February. When the thaws came, the stories that emerged were of hardship and loss, but also of survival. 3 villages, cut off and facing starvation, had been saved by the one person they had collectively dismissed. Agnes's larder, they started calling the cave. Her name became synonymous with foresight and a strange, quiet strength. She never moved to town. She stayed on her mountain, and the world came to her. Her dairy grew, becoming the economic heart of the region, her cheese traded far and wide. Mayor Thornton retired, and the new leaders of Havenwood made it a point to ensure the road to Agnes's cabin was the first one cleared every winter. She never spoke of the blizzard, or of Thornton's apology. She had no need for revenge. Her victory wasn't in their shame, but in their survival. Years later, travelers passing through would ask about the prosperous little villages, nestled in the shadow of the great mountain, and they would be told the story of the widow who was cast out. They would learn how she had listened to the stone, how she had turned milk and time into a fortress, and how, when the world froze, she had opened her doors. She had been rejected for her refusal to be small and dependent, and that very rejection had forced her to become the architect of her own salvation, and theirs. It was a quiet, moral victory, one that echoed not in grand speeches, but in the steady, life-giving work of her hands, and the enduring warmth of a community fed from the cold, stony heart of a mountain.